The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and at first I thought it was meant for someone else. It was from a marine financing company I had never heard of, and it was addressed to me, congratulating me on the successful approval of a $147,000 boat loan. I stood at my mailbox in the flat gray light of an October afternoon and read the same line 4 times. It's my name, my social security number, my address, a repayment schedule stretched across 10 years. A vessel described as a 2021 Beneteau Oceanies 46.1. I had never signed a single document. I had never spoken to this lender. I had never in my entire life wanted to buy a boat. I walked back inside and sat at my kitchen table, and I stayed there for a long time. There was no immediate rage. That surprises people when I tell this story, but it's the truth. What came first was something colder and more focused than rage. A kind of clarity that arrives when something you've half sensed in the abstract suddenly becomes entirely, undeniably real. I knew, sitting there with that letter on the table in front of me, exactly how this had happened. I didn't have every detail yet, but I knew the shape of it. I knew the person whose hands had built that shape. And I knew that whatever I did next needed to be careful, because there was a right way to respond to something like this and a dozen wrong ones. To understand why I knew without any real doubt, you need to understand my brother, and you need to understand me, and what the distance between us had always looked like from the outside. Rowan is 4 years older than me, and growing up, he was the kind of person that rooms seemed to reorganize themselves around. He had the easy, frictionless confidence of someone who had never been genuinely refused anything, and had, somewhere along the way, quietly concluded that this was simply the natural order of things, that the world accommodated people like him, as a matter of course. Teachers liked him. Neighbors liked him. Our parents' friends always had a comment ready about what he was going to do with his life, as though his potential was a fixture everyone could see. For most of my childhood, I believed in that version of him as readily as everyone else did. I was different in nearly every way that mattered. Quieter, more methodical, more interested in getting things right than in making them look impressive. I worked in project management for a mid-sized logistics company, and the skills that job required, identifying problems before they became crises, documenting everything, building clean systems and following them, turned out to be skills that organized my personal life as naturally as they organized my work. I paid my bills ahead of the due date. I kept my credit the way some people keep a garden, with consistent, unglamorous attention, not because it was exciting, but because I understood what it was worth. I lived alone in a second-floor apartment in a city that suited me exactly. Not spectacular, stable, and I did not understand, for a very long time, how carefully Rowan had been watching that stability from a distance. We were close, or I believed we were. He called most weekends. We had dinner when he came through the city, which was often because Rowan was always in motion, always working on some deal, some property flip, some partnership that was 6 weeks away from changing everything for him. He used the word opportunity, the way other people use punctuation, and for years I found it genuinely exciting to hear about. He made the world sound full of open doors, and I was content enough in my quiet, well-ordered life that I never examined too carefully why so many of his doors never seemed to lead anywhere permanent. I told myself that was just how ambitious people operated, always in the middle of the next thing, always just ahead of where you could see. The signs were there from early on. They were always there. I just wasn't looking at them the right way yet. The first thing I noticed, or rather, the first thing I allowed myself to notice, happened about 3 years before that letter arrived. Rowan called me on a Thursday evening, and he opened the conversation with how tired he sounded, which I understand now was its own kind of setup. He explained that he was in a tight spot with a supplier, something about a payment arrangement that had fallen through at the wrong moment, and he needed someone to co-sign a short-term business line of credit. Just to bridge a gap, he said. 60 days at most. He only needed my name on it because his own credit was temporarily complicated. I said no. Not angrily, I didn't feel anger. I felt something more like a quiet wrongness, the kind that doesn't demand your attention, but settles at the back of your mind and waits. He took it graciously, said he completely understood, that he had another option lined up anyway. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and by the time I hung up, I had nearly persuaded myself I'd been paranoid. But I remembered it. Over the years that followed, there were other things. Small things individually. He borrowed $300 and repaid it 6 months later without mentioning the delay, just a payment notification one morning with a casual emoji attached, no explanation, no acknowledgement. He used my streaming account without asking, and when I noticed a profile under an unfamiliar name, he said it was a friend's child who needed something to watch. When I said I'd prefer he just ask first, he laughed warmly and told me I was being precious about it. Not unkind, he was never unkind to me directly. He had something more effective than unkindness. He had a way of framing your reasonable objections as small, slightly embarrassing character traits, so that by the end of the conversation, you were the one who felt like you'd done something wrong. I also noticed, though I didn't fully name it at the time, that he had an unusual interest in my financial life. Not invasively, never anything you could point to directly. He mentioned once, framed as admiration, that I probably had excellent credit. He asked once, almost in passing, whether I still used the same bank from my 20s. He brought up my retirement contributions at dinner, in a way that sounded like curiosity. Each thing on its own was nothing. Taken together, across years, it was something else entirely. And then there was the dinner, about 18 months before the letter arrived, where I first heard him talk about boats. He'd been spending time on the coast, a friend's place, he said, someone with access to a yacht, and he had fallen into sailing with the intensity of someone who had already decided they were going to own one. He talked about specific models with a detailed proprietary fluency that told me the research had been going on for a while. He mentioned a Beneteau 47 by name, described what it would mean to have something like that, the freedom, the lifestyle, the asset value. I nodded and ate my dinner and thought he was being romantic about a new hobby. He'd had phases before, real estate photography, options trading, a bar he was going to open with a college friend that never materialized. I filed this alongside those and moved on. I should have paid closer attention. What I understand now is that by that dinner, the plan had likely already begun. He had my key. I'd given it to him 2 years earlier when I was traveling for work, and he'd offered to water my plants. I'd never asked for it back because it hadn't occurred to me to. He knew my employer, my approximate income, my bank, my address history, and everything else that two people accumulate about each other across a lifetime of being family. He had everything he needed. The only question was whether he'd use it. He did. After I sat with that letter long enough, I put it down and called Nalani. Nalani Croft and I met at a professional seminar about 7 years ago, and she became the kind of friend I don't speak to every week, but who is, without question, the first call I make when something actually matters. She worked in compliance for a financial services firm, which meant her entire professional life was organized around understanding the gap between how systems are supposed to work and how they actually do. She had a mind that sorted problems the way a careful archivist sorts documents, methodically, without sentiment, with a precise sense of what needed to be preserved and in exactly what order. She wasn't a lawyer, but she understood legal and financial structures with an intimacy most non-lawyers don't. And more than that, she had this quality I'd always valued. She could help someone think clearly in a moment when every instinct was pushing toward reaction. I told her what I was holding. I read the relevant details out loud, the loan amount, the lender name, the vessel description, my name on all of it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay. Don't touch anything yet. Don't call him, and don't call the lender. Tonight, pull your credit report from all three bureaus, Equifax, Experian, TransUnion, and tell me exactly what's on it." I did. And there it was. The hard inquiry from 4 months earlier. The open account, the loan attached to my social security number, with a secondary mailing address I didn't recognize listed alongside mine. The whole picture, printed out in the dry, matter-of-fact language of a credit report, which somehow made it feel more real than the letter had. I called Nelani back. He's had access to your documents at some point, she said, once I'd walked her through it. Your SSN, your date of birth, your address history. Probably your mother's maiden name too, since he'd already know it. Did he ever have a key to your place? He had. I'd given it to him 2 years earlier when I was traveling for work, and he'd offered to water my plants. I had never asked for it back, because he was my brother and it hadn't entered my mind to. I had left him alone in my apartment for a week, with my filing drawer unlocked, because filing drawers are not things you lock against your own family. Or so I had believed. All right, Nelani said. I need you to listen carefully, because the next steps matter more than anything that comes after. She paused. You are a victim of identity fraud. That is a federal crime. What happens from here depends almost entirely on how you handle the next few weeks. She explained it calmly and in sequence, the way she always approached things that needed to be understood rather than just reacted to. I had the right to dispute the fraudulent account with the credit bureaus under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. I could file an identity theft report with the Federal Trade Commission, which would generate an official report number and a formal recovery plan, a document, she explained, that carried genuine legal weight in every subsequent step, whether that was a creditor dispute, a law enforcement proceeding, or civil litigation. I could file a police report. I could notify the lender directly. Each step created a record, and the records built on each other. The most important thing right now, Nalani said, is documentation. Before you do anything visible, you document everything you have. And then you think carefully about what outcome you actually want. I sat with that question for the rest of the night. It would be easy to tell this story, as though I always knew exactly what I was doing, as though from the moment I opened that envelope, I had a clear, composed plan mapped out in front of me. That's not how it felt. What I felt, underneath the cold focus, was something I took a while to recognize properly. Something that would announce itself later, in quieter moments, as grief. Not the kind that comes suddenly. The kind that seeps in when you have to revisit years of shared history and look at it through a different lens. When you start asking yourself which dinners were genuine and which ones were useful. Which phone calls were connection and which ones were information gathering. Which moments of closeness were real and which was simply preparation. That kind of retroactive examination doesn't announce itself as grief. It just quietly restructures your past, room by room, until the place you thought you knew looks like somewhere slightly unfamiliar. I gave myself that night to feel it. And then by morning, I had moved. I spent the following 2.5 weeks doing everything in sequence, and I did it without telling Rowan a single thing. He texted twice during that time. Once to say he'd be in town, and did I want to have dinner. Once to send a photo of a marina at sunset with the caption, "Finally." I read both messages, set my phone face down on the desk, and kept working. I filed the FTC identity theft report through their identity theft Gov portal, a process that walked me through a formal recovery plan and produced an official report with a case number, which Nalani had explained carried real legal weight in every subsequent step. I filed a police report with my local department, which required sitting across from an officer who asked me 3 separate times, in the patient tone of someone hoping I'd change my mind, whether I was certain I wanted to proceed given that the person named was a family member. I said yes each time in the same even voice until he stopped asking. I pulled and printed all 3 credit bureau reports and made 2 sets of copies. I photographed and photocopied the letter from Meridian Marine Lending. I went through my own documents at home and took a full inventory. My social security card and passport was still in the fireproof box where they always lived. But what I couldn't account for was the week Rowan had spent in my apartment with my key and my unlocked filing drawer. The income documentation used in the loan application was something I couldn't trace directly. but I knew he was aware of where I worked and roughly what I earned. I'd mentioned a salary adjustment to him once at dinner, the kind of casual disclosure you make to a sibling without any thought of consequence. I didn't know exactly how he'd handled the verification requirements, but that was for investigators to determine. What I had was sufficient. I also researched Meridian Marine Lending. They were a regional lender specializing in boat and recreational vehicle financing, operating across several coastal states. They were legitimate, established, and they had been defrauded just as surely as I had. That detail mattered, not out of sympathy for a financial institution, but because it clarified something important. Meridian had their own $147,000 reason to move quickly once they understood what had happened. Our interests in that sense were aligned. On a Thursday afternoon 2.5 weeks after the letter arrived, I sat across from Deborah Hanley. Nalani had found her through a professional contact, someone whose judgment she trusted specifically on financial fraud matters. Deborah had a small, unremarkable office and a manner that communicated competence without performing it. When I finished laying everything out for her, the letter, the credit reports, the FTC filing, the police report, the apartment key, the dinner conversation about boats, she didn't offer reassurance or express surprise. She simply nodded once and said, "You have a very clean case. The question is what outcome you're prioritizing." She laid out the landscape plainly. The fraudulent account would almost certainly be removed from my credit once the disputes were properly supported by the FTC report. The bureaus were required to investigate and act. Meridian, once officially notified of the fraud with full documentation, would be obligated to investigate their own loan. And since the contract had been originated against falsified identity and fabricated income documentation, the vessel used as collateral had no legal protection. They would want it back or the money or both. On the criminal side, identity theft involving a fraudulent loan application at this dollar amount was a federal felony. The FTC report created a federal record. Whether that translated into active prosecution was a matter of law enforcement priorities and timeline, but the record existed and it would move. "How do you want to handle notification to your brother?" she asked. I had been thinking about this longer than anything else. I told her I wanted to send him a letter, formal, documented, certified mail, informing him that I had discovered the account, that I had already filed the relevant reports, and that I was giving him a defined window to contact me before I completed the final notification to the lender. Deborah asked me why I wanted to give him that window, and I told her the honest answer: I didn't want him to find out from a fraud investigator showing up at a marina, or from a law enforcement contact he wasn't expecting. I wanted him to know that I had discovered what he'd done, had understood it fully, had spent 3 weeks responding to it methodically, and that I was the one who had set everything in motion. I wanted that to be clear. She reviewed my draft, suggested 2 small changes to language that could have created ambiguity, and said the decision was mine. I mailed it the following Monday, certified with return receipt requested. He called 4 days later. I was at my desk at work when his name appeared on my screen. I looked at it, turned the phone face down, and finished what I was doing. He called again 20 minutes later. Then a text came through: "Celeste, please call me. It's urgent." I finished my workday, drove home, changed out of my work clothes, and made a cup of tea. Then I sat down at the same kitchen table where I had first opened that letter, and I called him back. He answered before the second ring. "Celeste." His voice was a version of itself I hadn't heard before. The ease was completely gone. He sounded like someone standing on ground that had just shifted and hadn't finished moving. "I got your letter." "I know," I said. I let the silence sit. That was something I'd learned over the previous weeks, to stop filling silence as a courtesy. I had spent years doing that in conversations with Rowan, smoothing things over, offering the next sentence before there was a gap. I was done with that. "I can explain," he said. "It was meant to be temporary." I was going to refinance it into my own name within 6 months, once a credit issue I was dealing with resolved. You were never supposed to know. It wasn't going to affect you in any real way. There it was. You were never supposed to know. Not, I'm sorry, I made a terrible decision. Not, I don't know what I was thinking. Just, you were never supposed to find out, so the fact that you did is the problem we're addressing now. I understood every layer of what that sentence meant. He had researched a lender, gathered my personal information, fabricated income documentation, submitted a loan application, navigated a verification process, signed documents in my name, and taken possession of a $147,000 vessel, and then continued to call me on weekends and send me photos from marinas, with the complete expectation that none of it would ever surface. That was not an impulse. That was a plan, and the plan had relied entirely on my trust. Rowan, I said. I filed an FTC identity theft report 3.5 weeks ago. I filed a police report the same week. I've retained an attorney. I've disputed the fraudulent accounts with all 3 credit bureaus. And in 48 hours, I'm going to complete the formal notification to Meridian Marine, lending that their loan was originated using stolen identity information and falsified documentation. He was quiet for a long time. What does that mean for the boat? He finally asked. I want to stay with that question for a moment, because it tells you everything about where his mind went first. Not, what does this mean for you, Celeste? Not, what have I done to my sister? Just, what does this mean for the boat? This thing he had acquired. The thing that had been the entire point. It means they'll open a fraud investigation, I said. The loan contract is fraudulent, which means the vessel used as collateral has no legal standing. They'll seek repossession and pursue you directly for recovery costs and legal fees. And depending on what the investigation surfaces about the documentation submitted with the application, there may be additional exposure beyond the civil matter. He was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice had lost another layer. Celeste. Something I had never heard from him was in his voice now, something that had been stripped of every practiced register, every calibrated quality he'd always carried. Come on. I'm your brother. I know, I said. Both things were completely true at once. He was my brother, and that fact was now entirely beside the point. I had spent enough time in the previous weeks, sitting with the grief of that particular combination, that I could say it without flinching. He tried for a few more minutes. His tone moved through registers, something close to pleading, then something edging toward frustration, then the brief shape of an argument forming before he seemed to recognize, somewhere in the middle of it, that there was no argument to make. I stayed level throughout all of it. Not cold, not performing distance, just genuinely finished being moved around by the emotional current of a conversation with him. I had spent years doing that. Smoothing things over, filling silences he left, making his discomfort my problem to solve. That was done. He eventually ran out of ground. I'm sorry, he said, quietly, without the performance of it. I believed him, and I also believed it was the kind of sorry that lives mostly in the shock of consequence, the sorry of someone who has just watched a door close that they had been certain would stay open. Maybe, with time and real reflection, the deeper kind of sorry would come for him. The kind that doesn't require the door closing first. That was entirely his to work toward. It had nothing to do with me anymore. Take care of yourself, Rowan, I said. And I ended the call, set my phone on the table, and finished my tea. The 48 hours passed. I sent the formal notification to Meridian Marine, lending through Deborah's office. A complete package that included the FTC report number, the police report case number, a written account of the identity theft, and copies of the key documentation I'd assembled. They acknowledged receipt within 2 business days. Their fraud investigation team contacted Deborah the following week, and after that, things moved with the kind of institutional momentum that doesn't require any further input from me. What unfolded over the following months is the part the word consequences doesn't quite capture, because consequences are rarely a single event. They're a slow, sustained rearrangement of circumstances. The lender's investigators confirmed the fraudulent nature of the application and the falsification of the income documentation. Meridian initiated legal proceedings against Rowan to recover the vessel and all associated costs. The boat was repossessed from the marina where he'd been keeping it. I learned that detail through Deborah in a brief, matter-of-fact phone update. I wasn't there for it. I didn't need to be, and I had never wanted to be. That was never the point. The fraudulent accounts were removed from my credit reports. The disputes I had filed, supported by the FTC report, were resolved in my favor within the timelines the law requires. Within 4 months, my credit was fully restored. The $147,000 liability that had been quietly sitting on it, attached to my name without my knowledge, was gone. The FTC report remained on file as a permanent federal record. Deborah told me that identity theft cases involving this level of financial fraud and falsified documentation were taken seriously at the federal level, though the timeline of any enforcement action was outside my control. I had made my peace with that long before she said it. I had done what I could do with what I had, and I had done it properly. The rest belonged to processes larger than me. Rowan lost the boat. He lost significant money fighting the lender's recovery claim and covering the legal costs that accumulated on his side. And, in the way these things tend to work, he lost the ability to simply move on and pretend none of it had happened, because the people in his life eventually asked questions when things fell apart around him, and the answers weren't ones that reflected well on him. I didn't tell anyone. I never had any interest in doing that. The situation told its own story, the way situations always do when the underlying facts are what they are. 6 months after our phone call, he sent me a message. It was long, longer than anything he'd sent me in years, and it had the particular quality of something rewritten several times, words chosen carefully, tone adjusted and readjusted in an attempt to land exactly right. He said he was sorry. He said he understood completely if I chose not to respond, and that he wouldn't reach out again if that was what I wanted. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking, not just about the loan, but about a longer pattern of behavior stretching back years, things he hadn't let himself look at directly before, and that he was working through it. He asked for nothing. I read it twice, sat with it for about a week, and then wrote back something brief and honest, that I appreciated him saying it, that I had no desire to return to the relationship we'd had before, and that I genuinely wished him well in building whatever came next for him. All 3 of those things were true without contradiction. Nalani came over for dinner the evening after I sent it. She brought a bottle of wine that was considerably better than anything I would have thought to choose, because she has always been the kind of person who marks moments with appropriate weight rather than letting them pass unacknowledged. We sat at the kitchen table, and I told her how it had all ended up. She listened without interrupting, the way she always listened, fully, without rushing me toward a conclusion. "How do you feel?" she asked when I'd finished. I thought about it honestly before I answered. "Lighter," I said. "Not happy exactly. Just lighter." She nodded as though that made complete sense to her, which it did, and poured us both more wine. We spent the rest of the evening talking about other things entirely. Her job, a trip she was planning, a book we'd both been meaning to get to for months. Ordinary things. That turned out to matter more than I'd expected, not just the resolution of the situation, but the easy return to ordinary life afterward. The discovery that things could simply go on and be genuinely fine and feel like yours again. There are 2 things this experience changed in me, and I think both of them are worth saying plainly. The first is practical. I check my credit reports every quarter now. I have a credit freeze in place with all 3 bureaus, which means no new account can be opened in my name without me explicitly and deliberately lifting it. I keep my important documents locked. I changed my locks after everything came to light. None of these are dramatic precautions, they are sensible ones that I should have adopted years earlier, and I wish I had. They cost almost nothing, and they matter enormously. The second change is harder to put into words, but I'll try. It has to do with the difference between being trusting and being unguarded, which I used to treat as essentially the same quality. I'm not less trusting now, not in any meaningful sense. I still believe that most people are operating in good faith most of the time. But I have a clearer, more honest understanding of the way love, family love especially, can be used as a form of access if you let it operate without any discernment at all. The people who know you best are, by definition, the people who know exactly which parts of you they can rely on. Rowan knew I would be slow to suspect him. He knew that when something felt wrong, I would push it aside because he was my brother and I loved him, and the alternative explanation seemed too painful to sit with. He built everything he built on the foundation of that trust, on the years I had spent giving him the benefit of the doubt, filling silences, smoothing things over, keeping the relationship intact at small costs to myself that I had never added up. And that is the thing I had to sit with the longest, after everything else was resolved. Not the betrayal in the abstract, but the specific and deliberate way my own good faith had been treated as a resource. I've thought about whether I would do anything differently. Whether I should have confronted him the moment I found out, or given him more time before filing, or said more on the phone that evening. I've examined it from every angle I can think of. And every time I come back to the same place, I did it the way I needed to do it. Not for an audience, not to make a point to anyone watching, just because it was the right way to handle something serious, and it deserved to be handled seriously. The boat is gone. My credit is clean. My brother is somewhere doing whatever work he's capable of doing on himself, and that is entirely his to figure out. And I am here, in my apartment, in my city, paying my bills ahead of schedule and tending to my life with the same steady attention I always have. It turns out that was always enough. I just needed to stop letting someone quietly borrow against it.